Welcome back to The Heat. Our conversation continues now with Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. He's a 31-year Army veteran and served as Chief of Staff for U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell. From London, we're joined by Chris Woods. He's an investigative journalist who specializes in conflict and national security issues. And also here with us in the studio is Christine Fair. She's an assistant professor with the Security Studies program at Georgetown University. Welcome to all of you. Colonel, let me start with you again now. We talked about the effectiveness of the drone program. What can one say about the argument that the drone program actually increases the number of people who become militants? As you pointed out earlier on, no less than Donald Rumsfeld said that killing one terrorist creates 10 more. Can that be considered a success?
I think that is part of the problem. It's this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth philosophy, for example, which is as old as the human race. And you ask yourself, if you implement that kind of philosophy, what do you wind up with? Two blind men, two blind women, whatever. I don't think its efficacy in certain circumstances on the conventional field, as Chris pointed out, is any different than that of close air support, which is really what they're being used for when a fast mover can't be on the location and a drone is close by. It's used for close air support. That's different from selecting people and essentially assassinating them from the air. I think Professor Akbar Ahmed at American University, in his book, The Thistle and the Drone, and by the way, I might point out that he was a local administrator in Waziristan and has a great deal of experience to speak from about the federally administered tribal areas in Pakistan in general, that not much has changed, that this is a way for central powers to eliminate the periphery, as he puts it. In other words, in his 40 case studies in his book, he demonstrates how we are ethnically cleansing, to use the term of art of today, a lot of these tribes by supporting the central government and going after them. And in a certain way, the drones are one of those tools, one of those weapons that are being used.
Okay. Chris, I want to get to something else which the Bureau of Investigative Journalism has been reporting on, and that is, you say that something like 3,000 civilians, including some 200 children, have been killed in drone strikes carried out by the United States. In many instances, these drone strikes are carried out in very remote areas where it's very difficult to gather information about who's been killed and whether they're civilians or whether they're military or militants, etc. So how did you get that information?
So it's just a clarification. I'm no longer with the Bureau. I haven't been there for about 18 months, but they're one of the monitoring organizations that tracks civilian deaths. Their best estimate, by the way, is around 400 civilian deaths in Pakistan, not 3,000, and around, I think, 160, 170 children. That estimate is gathered by media reports, by field investigations, by lawsuits, by a whole host, and also by information from the Pakistan government, which itself places the minimum estimate of civilian casualties from US drone strikes at about 400 dead. I have to say that is mainly historical. Certainly since around 2010, the US has gone to some significant degree to reduce civilian deaths in the tribal areas. We see very few reported civilian deaths now. That's been a consistent pattern over a number of years. But historically, I think the CIA treated FATA as a private battleground. They worked with the collusion of the Pakistan government. It was in neither of their interests to draw attention to the deaths of civilians when they happened. We occasionally saw really terrible civilian casualties caused there, and then both parties then covering those up. So it's very difficult to get the information. It's not impossible, as some people portrayed it. I was able to visit Waziristan myself about 18 months ago, have limited access to some of the areas that the CIA had historically hit. It is possible to gather that information. It's difficult, but it's also necessary, and I'll qualify that. At the moment, CENTCOM, which is obviously involved in the airstrikes in Syria and Iraq, is being pretty transparent. It's issuing daily releases telling us where it's bombing, with what aircraft, with what allies, and so on. What it won't tell us is who it's bombing and how many are being killed.
Okay, Christine, you've made the point that, you know, civilians are being killed, but we cannot know how many civilians are being killed. As you pointed out, it's unknowable.
Well, so I think that I really am appreciative of the point that Chris Woods just made. Many of the human rights organizations, for example, the report that was done by the legal clinics at Stanford, NYU Law, says it's impossible to go. It's not. Chris Albrighton for AP did a fabulous piece where he went in and he investigated several, using stringers, of course, from Waziristan. And he found that with the exception of one very large drone strike that was a very large mistake, 90% of the people, according to locals, were in fact terrorists, according to the locals. And that does say something, that the people who were preparing the graves considered these people to be combatants. But I do want to point out that in Fatah, there is a war going on. So this idea that there's not going to be civilian casualties is really quite preposterous. I think this question of proportionality, I think is really important. Right now, the Pakistanis are operating a fairly significant, very crude offensive in North Waziristan Agency. The entire population of North Waziristan Agency is slightly under 1 million. Over half of that population has been displaced from Pakistani air campaign. The air chief, the vice air chief of Pakistan in 2011 noted that from the beginning of the war on terror, circa end of 2001, 2002, the Pakistanis themselves had conducted over 50,000 combat sorties, compared to, at the time, a handful of, well, not a handful, at that point, maybe 200 drone strikes. So you have to look at the proportionality. So I think the real issue is not the civilian casualties anymore. And I believe Chris Woods himself has said this in various forums, because civilian casualties are no longer the biggest objection to the drone program. If in fact you are of the belief that civilian casualty minimization should be an objective of any military confrontation, the question should be asked, why don't we only use drones? Because clearly what the Pakistanis are doing with F-16s, with artillery, with helicopter, Cobra attack helicopters, the civilian casualties are numerous and the entire communities have been devastated. So I don't think the civilian casualty issue is what we really should be debating. I think that for me...
I still think it is, though, Christine, just to jump in there.
Well,
400 civilian deaths is a lot. I mean, it is something we need to talk about.
I don't disagree with you per se, but compared to the Pakistani operations, we're talking about thousands.
I agree with that.
I'd be quick to point out, too, that we're not talking about the Pakistanis, we're talking about us.
Well, we are talking, because there's actually an active conflict. If you knew anything about Pakistan, you would know that there's been an active conflict throughout the Fatah area since late 2001.
And we're not talking about the Pakistani ruthlessness, we're talking about us.
We are cooperating in that.
We're talking about the United States of America doing something, not about the Pakistanis.
You don't understand the battlefields.
But just to get back to the point, Professor, Professor Wilkerson, that you made earlier on, that when we look at the effectiveness of the drone strikes, I mean, isn't that counterproductive when we talk about civilian deaths?
Well, it is, and let me say also that I think Chris,
I'll come back to you in a moment.
I think Chris is right, and I'm encouraged by what this administration has done. Yeah. Largely, I'm told, by people whose views I trust, because of the intelligence being not that trustworthy. So they've limited strikes where the intelligence is not that trustworthy. I think this administration has tightened up the use of drones considerably, and I applaud that.
Okay, so two very important empirical interventions. First of all, we can't say what the efficacy of the program is because we don't know who we're targeting. So if you're going to do an empirical exercise of efficacy, you have to know who the person is that you're targeting, what organization they're a part of, what network are they embedded in. And then to this idea that does get paraded about, that you kill one terrorist, you make 3. In Pakistan, which is a country that I know very, there is no evidence for this. And there's also a really interesting concept of quantity versus quality. What is very clear, and Chris Woods talked about this when he talked about this notion of displacement, what we are seeing is basically target substitution because the networks of those terrorist organizations have been degraded. We are basically going after these middle persons who live in Fatah, who are the linchpin between, and then the other point, what you just said about the Obama administration is just shockingly untrue. The Obama administration expanded the drone program over the Bush administration, but the problem where we had the civilian casualties is that we were engaging in what was called signature strikes, not personality strikes. Signature strikes, we don't even know who we're killing. We have some intelligence that a set of targets have certain characteristics.
I think that's what I said.
No, you didn't say that.
You said exactly what I said.
And so Obama expanded the use of those signature strikes, and it was only after significant criticism from BIJ, NAF, and others that the Obama administration curtailed these signature strikes.
I'm rapidly running out of time. I'm rapidly running out of time. Colonel, we've got about 30 seconds. There's no evidence to show that these strikes have created more militants.
I think that's dubious. At best, that's dubious. I also would like to point out again, if I only have a few seconds left, that the rising number of post-traumatic stress individuals in the military is amongst drone operators. That's your warrior ethic.
Well, that's the one truthful thing he said.
That's where we are going to have to leave it. That's it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CCTV America's Facebook page to comment on this or any show, or chat with us on Twitter at CCTV America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.